Today I want to talk about the Supreme Court overturning of affirmative action. I believe the name of the case was Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard. Of course, affirmative action is something that has been chipped away at for a long period of time now. It's been many decades. Since from the very beginning, affirmative action was controversial. It created a ton of resentment between different ethnic groups. I think it's kind of telling that a lot of this resentment started to really boil over, and we started to see successes, specifically when Asian Americans, or in this case, this wasn't even an Asian American who's the public face of all this. His name is Calvin Yang, and he was a student in Canada, right? So he's Chinese Canadian. But it's kind of telling that in all these cases of affirmative action, it's really when Asian Americans and other Asians got involved that the tide began to turn. These are groups that tend to have outsized power relative to other immigrant groups, right? I've long argued that far from viewing generic immigrants, meaning voluntary immigrants, as just kind of like all-around victims, that seems to be the case in a lot of the kind of like, I guess, liberal talking points. Immigrants are actually some of the most privileged groups in the world, right? Because if you think about the bottleneck effect of being able to leave one country for another country, all the kinds of things that go into it, whether it's everything from survivorship bias to just the kind of people that get selected for that sort of movement, right? In China, for instance, if you're living very deep in the countryside, it would be a lot harder for you to make it to the United States compared to someone from the cities. This has been true historically. It's the case still now. If you look at the kind of activism that is done in sort of like Asian circles, let's say in New York City, it tends to be very non-specific. It tends to be kind of business oriented. It tends to be along the lines of fair admissions, right? This has been something that has been a concern for a long time, and we didn't see that much motion here, or sufficient motion, right, to overturn it until recent events. So first of all, from a conceptual standpoint, I am not against affirmative action. I totally recognize the idea that all else being equal, it is true that, for instance, an Asian or a white person applying to the same school for the same spot, all else being equal, I'm pretty sure that most institutions, they would treat preferentially a black candidate versus someone from another ethnic group. It is also pretty obvious to me that affirmative action of a very different sort is just going on in different ways, in different directions, every single second of our existence. So, for example, it is true that if you are a black American, you have less of a chance of getting mortgages. It is true that all else being equal, being black means that you are going to be turned down for many different jobs. Now, it's true that there are some institutions that would, again, treat black applicants preferentially because they want to sort of cozy up to the idea that they are diverse, that they are seeking racial justice. I get all of that, but generally speaking, what the studies show is that black faces, black names, that sort of thing, even with equal qualifications, that tends to damage the prospects of employment for black Americans. But it is also true that we have a kind of de facto affirmative action for white Americans and other privileged groups. This is not something that is technically written into the law in the way that affirmative action might be, which is why affirmative action is subject to these kinds of attacks, whereas all these other kinds of superstructures are not. At the same time, they are just as real as if it were, in fact, the law. One example I could use from my own life is when I was growing up and I was studying for the SATs, I also couldn't afford a tutor. But one thing that I could do compared to maybe some of my black friends was the fact that I had the opportunity to lock myself in my room, right? So first of all, it's my room, not anybody else's. I don't share it with anybody else. It was my bedroom. I would lock myself in there for, I remember it was like 12 weeks straight. I had dozens and dozens and dozens of practice tests that I took. I didn't have to go out and work any other jobs. I didn't have siblings to look after. I didn't have to worry about anything except, okay, well, even if I don't have the tutor, if I'm self-directed enough, no one is actually standing in my way to go out and, you know, just get it done, right? Get the test taking done, get everything done that I need to finish in order to do well on the tests. Now, since it so happens that the test is an important part of college admissions, it meant that specifically because of who I was and the, you know, part of the world that I come from, and the kind of advantages that I had, I was able, even without a tutor, to essentially do well. My zip code wasn't the greatest place to live in the world, but it was much better than some of the other zip codes that I knew. If I was tired of studying and I wanted to get up in the middle of it and go for a long walk in my neighborhood, I could do that without fearing any kind of harm coming to me. Very different from the experiences of friends that I had, that before they would take walks or go to different neighborhoods, they would have to call in and ask, is it okay if I come by? Is there anybody there that I shouldn't see? And my school, although it was a predominantly black school, it did not have necessarily, like, you know, it wasn't the 24/7 kind of stereotypes that you would associate with a majority black school in New York City, right? There were definitely classes I was in and situations in the hallway and stuff like that that was just totally wild. But even in the kind of, like, let's say standard, you know, non-honors, non-AP classes that I was in, it was not a wild experience. I mean, kids weren't doing that well, but I was never distracted by them. They weren't trying to, like, you know, pull me out of class. But I could very easily have been in a different school, or if I was in a different race, I could easily be in a different school, right? A zone to my neighborhood. And my experiences, even just being in the classroom and the kind of peer pressure I'd be put under, that would look very different as well, right? So affirmative action is a de facto experience for white Americans. Again, it's not a letter of the law, but it just so happens that based on where you're born, right? Your zip code. It just so happens that based on whether or not you're able to, like, easily walk around outside without any fears, it just so happens, right? All these things that accumulate bit by bit by bit by bit, and the kinds of things that, you know, these schools value, which is something that I want to talk about. The kinds of things that are said to be social goods, right? The kinds of ways that you're asked to sort of, you know, participate in either like scholarship or, like, you know, how you treat your studies, what kinds of things that you should angle for. All those things are already preformed and they were given to everybody, irrespective of their background, as this is a noble pursuit. This is how you go about doing things, right? So there is a de facto affirmative action for whites based on the fact that they fit very nicely, generally, or more nicely than non-whites in this kind of grander superstructure. So even if we were to concede some unfairness in any kind of policy of affirmative action, the fact is we have to, at the same time, if we're making that concession, we have to also concede the idea that the same exact thing is happening, often in reverse or in other directions and in all kinds of different ways that are sometimes even difficult to verbalize unless you're actually in those experiences. All those things are happening at the same time as letter of the law affirmative action is going on, right? And that part is undeniable. However, there are many other problems with affirmative action that don't necessarily get the same amount of attention because, I mean, these are not the kinds of concerns that people would typically bring up, right? Generally, affirmative action is a kind of, it's essentially infighting, sometimes within ethnic groups and usually outside of ethnic groups, right, between ethnic groups. But if you really look at what affirmative action has accomplished over the last few decades, you definitely have, on the one hand, more, let's say, Black Americans or other groups that would make it into various universities than otherwise would be, right? And the thinking was, well, we're going to get, as many people as we can. They're going to either return to their neighborhoods, or they're going to have children, and they're going to be wealthier, more educated, and little by little, right, just very gradually, all these inequalities will start to be erased by way of education, right? That's kind of the idealized thinking. But the problem with that thinking is as follows. So first of all, this is an exceptionally slow process that has like a number of assumptions there that I wouldn't necessarily agree with. If you're suddenly in a school that you'd otherwise not be in, the idea is if you become, more educated, and if there's all these other black people that get left behind, well, it wouldn't really so much matter, because maybe you could have children, and you could outpace the birth rate of everybody that's left behind, and eventually you have like a more educated class, right? People don't ever make that kind of like set of judgments and chronology of events so explicit, but really that's just kind of the thought, right? And I'm not so sure that very educated people, first of all, they're not going to have kids at a fast rate. They're also not going to necessarily move back to these same neighborhoods, right? You're just creating, the same problems. You're just recreating a kind of like side-by-side underclass, right? They might look like you, but they don't necessarily have the same experiences, even if they're of the same color. There's also the fact that affirmative action, although yes, there is definitely a lot of, there's a strong link between socioeconomic status and other items of that nature and race. But when you look at schools like Harvard and stuff like that, the people that tend to apply and get in, right, they already are pretty self-directed. They already have, if not the advantages of color, they would at least have the advantages of a certain kind of parental structure. They might have certain economic, advantages directly in terms of like tutoring. I remember like one time when I was in high school, I was dating a Haitian girl, and although she obviously did not come from money, and she was in a bad neighborhood, her family had enough money where they were able to send her to private school. She was able to kind of like escape, the worst case sort of scenarios. And again, this is someone that has no real privileges in her background at all, other than, a mother that was a good mother, and, a kind of like self-directed mentality. But affirmative action that is based on race is not necessarily going to distinguish between a black American that comes from a really privileged background and a black American that comes from the exact opposite of a privileged background. In that kind of system, what eventually happens is the people that get into these elite schools, they tend to be funneled in, if not, like before their academic life begins and after academic life begins, they get funneled into and through a similar set of assumptions, a similar set of values. And again, we're just kind of recreating some of these same problems again and again and again. If you're not going to really look at socioeconomics in this equation, you really are missing a major point of departure for really, like if you think of like politics as branching off, the assumptions under politics branching off in various directions, these kinds of departures are really what causes some of these branches to diverge in that way. So ultimately, we get a kind of illusion of representation, right? It's a representation that is purely based on color, and it's not really taking into consideration what happens when different like groups and subgroups and subgroups, all this stuff. Like, we're not really capturing how all that gets atomized and how different the experiences are for different subgroups within a grander group. And the illusion of representation is especially damaging because it allows corporations, it allows institutions to, essentially say, well, look at our student body, or look at our workforce. We can't possibly be contributing to these problems. We're in fact doing things to solve for these problems. And yet, at the same time, these same companies are lobbying for the continued sort of like, lowering of taxes again and again and again. I mean, even like Joe Biden's proposal for a 15% corporate tax minimum is de facto lobbying for a lower tax rate, because first of all, that's lower than the post-Trump corporate tax rate of 23%. So if we adopt 15%, you know, that engenders yet another race to the bottom. It's also lower than the average internationally. So we are essentially creating another race to the bottom. But if you have a race to the bottom in taxes, you're never going to get true desegregation. You're never going to get a true kind of like, you know, a coalition of people that have a truly shared politics, because they don't live around one another, they don't trust each other, and that's simply how it works, right? So problem, of course, is that although here I'm able to have all these critiques of affirmative action, some of these like counter proposals that I would have, whether it's like, you know, going by socioeconomic status, it's not, you know, that's not really on the table either, right? It's not as if with Biden in office, or with like really any 2024 Republican in office, or, you know, Biden's second term, it's not as if we're going to have any of these options put on the table. Now, before I get into why I think it might not really matter in the long term, there was a tweet by a white woman that she seems to be some sort of Democratic Party operative. I forget off the top of my head, but I'm going to have it play on screen for you guys now. But basically, she got in trouble for saying something along the lines of, well, you know, Black Americans, they can't succeed in a purely merit-based system, right? And this is the kind of conundrum that liberals and conservatives find themselves in. Specifically for liberals, the kind of messaging that is required and the kind of argumentation that is required to get their sort of policy points across, it's not very intuitive, it's not very obvious. So for instance, like if you're going to be arguing for why abortion ought to be legal, right, you're going to have to start talking about things like personhood, right? If you want to go that route, you're going to have to start talking about things like, you know, the supremacy of bodily autonomy, bodily rights. You're going to start talking about the separation of church and state, and to what extent a kind of like hardline anti-abortion position is just a kind of extension of religious thinking. Whereas a conservative would just say, well, look, it's a life. You're murdering unborn children. The same is true for affirmative action, right? We could bring in all these other suppositions and all these concerns, but the fact is, for the vast majority of people, the way that they experience everyday life, it's going to feel that, you know, something unfair is going on. On the other hand, it is also true that Black Americans, right, they're going to feel resentful of the idea, even if they, you know, overwhelmingly support affirmative action. There's definitely going to be, even among support, there's going to be this contingent of people that will say essentially, well, you know, is my life essentially an asterisk? Is everything that I succeed in doing, is that going to be an asterisk? Can I really just like not succeed on my own merits? And this is, I think, what this woman was getting at. But I mean, the way that she phrased it is both kind of clunky, but it's also in some ways sort of accurate. That's obviously not to say that there is some sort of like incapability, right, for, you know, Black Americans, like anybody that's born in any situation. You don't have to be Black. You could be, you know, in the deepest pits of poverty and danger and violence in, I don't know, like Kashmir, India or whatever. And you could still technically become the most famous and richest, you know, and greatest poet that has ever lived. Technically, that option is open to anybody. But as a statistical matter, if the way that we define merit is, for instance, doing well in the SATs, well, now you're going to have to do a number of things that might not be so easily available to you compared to other people. There's also the fact that, I mean, just the way that we would define merit is an issue to me, because when I think of merit, like true merit, I always put in the back of my mind, well, what did this person really have to go through? So the guy that became the public face of all this, right, he's 21 years old, Calvin Yang, he really thinks that he's hot shit, right? When he talks about himself, he says, you know, I got a near perfect score on the SATs, right? I played 2 varsity sports. I wonder exactly what those sports were, right? But that's a different question. I played, you know, 2 varsity sports. I was in this like 30 under 30 Canada, whatever list it was. I did exceptionally well in school. I had all these extracurriculars besides sports. I started this I had this like startup regarding policy. At the same time, Calvin Yang, as a Chinese American, if he was not a Chinese American, he was just Chinese and applying to Harvard, most likely he would not be able to say all those things about himself, right? Especially if he had happened to come from a less affluent, right, part of the Chinese population. It would also be much more impressive, obviously, if you were able to say all these things about yourself if you come from a typically bad black neighborhood in America, right? Because suddenly you have all these impediments that no one else had, right? And I think this is a kind of like a core issue for many of the people making these kinds of arguments. They see the fact that they don't have any core impediments and everybody else does. And they believe that, well, we shouldn't even consider these kinds of impediments. We should just overall just kind of like work under the assumption that merit is all that matters. But we're not even talking about anything like this, right? We're talking about essentially children, right? 16 years old when people start thinking about college, 17 they start applying. If you're taking a year off, maybe you're applying also at 18 years old. We're talking about kids that don't really have any genuine accomplishments, right? And on a fundamental level, Calvin Yang, he could think that he's hot shit, but he hasn't really done anything. If you look at the New York Post article that he wrote on all this, very kind of stereotypical language, very stereotypical arguments, very kind of stale writing. When you look at his specific, like, I am a great pianist, right? But it's like, well, not good enough to actually perform, not actually good enough to, make actual like compositions that are great compositions that we'll all remember. So we're not even talking about grown men, right? And we're just assessing the difference between 50 versus 100 great poems or 0 great poems versus 5. We're talking about kids that don't really have much accomplishment. All that happens at that point when you're like 18 years old or whatever it was when he applied, 17 years old, 16 years old, all that really happens in that situation is you're sort of kind of like thrown into the world with everything that you have and everything that you don't have. And you come away with just like a few little hints. And these hints are especially occluded by the fact that depending on what's going on in your life, the hints are going to look totally different. And they are not at all an indication as to whether or not you will do better than somebody else, or not an indication whether or not you're worthy, right? We have to really strip away all these contexts for us to really get to the bottom of this. And affirmative action, by essentially being a kind of like sledgehammer approach, it sort of did some of that. Maybe not like exceptionally well, but well enough, right? Well enough by virtue of the fact that there was no credible alternative that I saw being offered, right? Nothing by socioeconomic status or any other kind of marker, right? So whatever effects that affirmative action had, it was definitely better than 0, but we haven't really seen huge dents in stuff like wealth inequality and other kinds of racial gaps, right? That did not clearly occur over the last 30, 40, 50 years, right? That has not really been happening. And even as all this was being chipped away at, one thing that the critics could always point to is like, well, we're not really doing and accomplishing the things that you said that we're going to accomplish, right? Which is like another issue like liberal politics over the last half century. All the promises that liberal politics have made, they were not really delivered upon. And people see this, right? This could be conservatives who are sort of watching from behind all this. It could be people that are current or prospective liberal voters, or it just could be people that were ex-liberal voters and are now using this as evidence against the idea that, voting Democrat, for example, is the right way to go. If we can't easily point to clear successes in affirmative action, or we can sort of point but not really, and they're easily obscured, that's going to erode support. And so amidst this erosion of affirmative action, liberals should ask themselves, what exactly are they trying to accomplish? Because I think on some level, honestly, all this might not really matter, in the sense that if you look at what universities are producing now, which is professionals who are kind of like, let's call them, I'm going to be interviewing Benjamin Studebaker in a couple of days, and he uses the phrase fallen professionals. So if we have all these so-called fallen professionals that are being produced by universities, and then on the other hand, we have this kind of resurgence of, right, this kind of like new ascendancy of like actual skilled blue-collar work, I do think that ultimately, as white people are going to be like the last ones to sort of get out of this sinking ship, right, which is like university level education, specifically the kind of lack of investment that we've had in public education, right? It's all kind of been going more and more in a kind of like privatized direction. When you look at per capita investment, it tends to be lower than it used to be. Compare that with China. China is just totally rehauling and reestablishing investment into this sort of like, like public infrastructure, public education. And we're doing the exact opposite. And coronavirus only accelerated that trend. You see many more students now, for instance, are either homeschooled or in private school because parents and kids don't want to deal with the bullshit, so they're going somewhere else, right? These are services that should be provided by the government, and they're not. The same thing is true of education. If education is supposed to lead to, greater upward mobility, and obviously all else being equal, it does, it has progressively done less and less of this. And I said this before, but some of the happiest and most well-off and like best adjusted human beings that I know are people like in actual like blue-collar trades, right? Not like necessarily just regular menial work, but actual trades, right, that you cultivate. I do think that if Democrats ever do manage to run and win with like an actual visionary leader, one of the things that he or she will do is really hammer home this idea of trade schools, this idea of you don't necessarily have to do everything, right, like just like all purely university related. Disproportionately, this would have an effect on Black Americans, right? And it would eventually be white people that are doing this kind of catch up in reverse, right? Which is going to create another kind of set of resentments, but we'll deal with those as we get there. Long term, since people do seek to better their own condition, and since I do believe in this kind of like long term trajectory of progress in human history, I do think that people will sort of gravitate towards a different way of doing things that will nonetheless have a disproportionately positive effect on Black Americans and other, like underserved groups, versus something that just brings out a ton of resentment, right? I mean, even things like, like debt forgiveness, right? There's like a ton of controversy there because people just can't get over the idea that, they pay down their student debts and now somebody else doesn't have to or doesn't have to pay as much, right? People are they're very much stuck in that mentality. They're very worried about how other people are doing, how other people are feeling, what position that they're in. And if that's going to be constantly on their minds, right, we're going to see these resentments pop up again and again, especially if at least the image, right, the image is one of a rapidly shrinking pie, right? Which is kind of funny because if you think of like human history of the last half century, the total pie has like, expanded like so hard, right? So hard at the expense of environment, at the expense of all these other considerations. The pie has expanded in exchange for tons and tons of externalities. Now, we are entering a time in history where the pie might start very well to actually shrink because those externalities, whether it's climate or whatever, are going to be catching up to us. So I'm just wondering, if people couldn't deal with the implications of a rapidly expanding pie whose overwhelming kind of like size is just going more and more to, the oligarch class, What are they going to do when everyone has to essentially downsize, including the oligarchs? The Biden administration, and it's going on and on and on, right? About Republican evils, about, you know, all these promises about, you know, fascism is coming in 2024 if we don't do this or we don't do that. They're not really doing anything about this either, right? Because I mean, I've made the argument before that in many respects, this court isn't a legitimate court. But if you are in power and you do nothing about an illegitimate court, you do own that court, right? You can't just say, we have these people on the bench that are totally uncontrollable. If you can't control them, there's other things that you could do, right? I would have easily said, you know, let's nix affirmative action in exchange for a federal job guarantee, right? Because that would disproportionately affect Black Americans. Let's nix affirmative action in exchange for Medicare for all, right? Because that would also disproportionately affect Black Americans. Let us nix affirmative action in exchange for, and you just go down the list, right? The top 12 items that will positively impact America as a whole, but will disproportionately impact the poorest, which means it will disproportionately impact Black Americans, Native Americans, right? Different subgroups of Asian Americans, right? The Asian groups that, you know, they were never part of this lawsuit, were they, right? Mr. Yang, he looks a certain way. He comes from China, not as a refugee, he comes on a voluntary basis. The refugee groups coming out of Asia have totally different life outcomes in America, even if technically, well, they're part of the same group. As a refugee, you don't have that same bottleneck effect, right? There is no real selection bias. It's the whole mass of humanity, right, is allowed in. And if you're a refugee, most likely, right, you're not one of the winning groups in that whatever regime that you're escaping from. This has been Alex Sheremet of Automachination. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.